Thank you all for joining us for this most timely webinar. I believe it will be most timely. Is the UK-EU reset on track for the environment? I'm Ben Reynolds, Executive Director here at IEEP UK. As everyone joining will know, the UK and EU Reset Summit held in May 2025 marked the most significant change in tone of relations since the Brexit vote, and also saw major commitments to measures which see advances in cooperation and inevitably compromise as well. Whilst it would be hard to argue that the environment was framed as a priority for the reset, it's not immaterial that 30 of the 61 points in the Common Understanding document came under the heading Strengthening Our Economies While Protecting Our Planet and Its Resources. And lest we forget, both EU and UK have similar ambitions and a richly intertwined history on environment and climate policy. The agreement to link emissions trading schemes and carbon border adjustment mechanisms underlines this joint climate ambition and determination and increases regulatory certainty for businesses working across Europe and removes the risk of additional costs to British exporters. Other aspects of the reset saw fishing deals and the promise of a veterinary or SPS agreement intended to ensure a smoother flow of trade, but also imposing standards for food and farming of which the UK will have little say. But where the initial announcements promised swift deals, the drip feed of announcements since then has led to a slightly murkier pool, and you'd be forgiven for losing track of the current status on those initial agreements. So we hope that this webinar will shed more light on what progress has been made to date on these commitments, how they will actually be put into place, noting the EU partnership bill that is mooted to do this, what will the impact on these commitments and this bill be on the environment, businesses and the public. So also with the commitment to hold these reset summits annually, what might we expect on the agenda for this summer's reset meeting? Is it simply going to be a progress update, or will there be developments on other issues? Might this include some of the lower hanging environmental fruits, such as alignment on chemicals and other policy areas, or the UK starting closer relationships with institutions, including the European Environment Agency? A little bit of context about IEEP UK first. So returning briefly to this point on the deeply intertwined nature of the UK and EU's environment policy, it would be remiss of me not to flag that this is our IEP's 50th anniversary, at least for the IEP family, of which IEP UK is part. Over this half century, my colleagues and predecessors have strived together with our partners and allies to strengthen the UK's elbow in raising the EU standards, and in many areas felt its weight when lagging. And whilst this relationship between the UK and the EU is different, the history remains, as does the influence of both on each other. And putting aside our long-standing work at IEP UK on tracking divergence, which you can find ample detail of on our website, I'm sure my colleagues will be sharing links to that shortly. There is a clear desire to learn from each other, with the EU keeping notes on the UK, and particularly England's agricultural policy and payment reforms and biodiversity net gain, and vice versa, the UK keen with the EU. And next week, IEP UK will be hosting a visit of Commissioner Roswell alongside Minister Mary Craig to talk about shared approaches to the circular economy. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to do a little housekeeping. So we are recording this webinar and we'll be posting it on our website in due course. A reminder that the Q&A box is open, so please place your questions in there rather than in the main chat. And you can upvote questions that you'd like to be addressed. And please use the main chat to post any links that you may feel are relevant to attendees, e.g. to reports, media articles, that kind of thing. And you can also communicate with the organisers via the chat function. And thank you to Ed and the rest of the team who are working busily behind the scenes to get and keep this webinar on track. At the end of the session, a feedback form will appear automatically in your browser. So we'll really appreciate any feedback as it helps us to improve future events. Without further ado, on to business. So I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic lineup. And we're going to be first hearing from Emily Lidgate, Professor of Environmental Law at the University of Sussex, followed by Alistair Carmichael, MP for Orkney and Shetland. We'll then be joined by the rest of our panel, David Baldock, Honorary Fellow at IEP UK, Josie Cohen, who's Head of Policy and Campaigns at Pan UK, and Beth Barker, who's Head of Policy at Aldersgate Group. So I will introduce our speakers more fully ahead of their contributions, and then we'll be followed by a panel discussion, and then a chance to take some questions from the audience from the Q&A. So I'm pleased to kick off with Emily Lydgate, who is Professor of Environmental Law at the University of Sussex, co-director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, and Deputy Director of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy. Her research examines the relationship between environmental protection and economic integration through trade, and she has advised the UK House of Commons EFRA Committee and taught at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's Advanced Diplomatic Academy. And she's also an Associate Fellow at Chatham House and has conducted research for UNEP, UKRI, the British Standards Institute, and the UK Committee on Climate Change and EU Horizon 2020. Welcome, Emily. I understand you've got some slides, which I think will be appearing on the screen any second. But I'd like to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. And thank you also to IEEP, who have provided a huge public service over the years, helping us sort out this very complex landscape of EU divergence. And I suppose what we're going to talk about today is the other side of the coin. You know, how do we undiverge? How do we reharmonize? How do we reset? And I thought I would start out by posing the question of what are we resetting exactly? And I'm going to focus on one aspect of this, which is agri-food regulation and the SPS Common Area negotiations, because I think this is a really fascinating area for tracking the UK's journey. Next slide, please, Ed. So single market, pre-Brexit, you know, we had, as for people who are in this call know better than anyone, it's very hard to sort out what the level of harmonization is, but very, very high and certainly seamless in terms of trade-related regulation. Then we moved to the hardest possible Brexit. So third country status with the EU, full documentary and physical border inspections. So just to put this into context, the EU imposes fewer border checks on agri-food imports from New Zealand, which is 11,000 miles away, than the UK, despite the fact that the EU is the destination of 2/3 of our agri-food exports. And now we're looking at moving not back to the single market, but a sort of quasi-single market, because under the SPS Common Area proposal, the vast majority of animal and plant products will be trade will be undertaken without border checks. So we're talking about sort of broad and deep harmonization. So I'll offer a few thoughts on what it's going to take to get from there at the bottom to back up to towards the top. But this is where that, you know, what is a reset question comes back, because I want to emphasize in particular the UK domestic governance aspect of this, which I think is often overlooked. And I'd also like to argue that having a consultative and democratically engaged approach to EU alignment is important for future-proofing the SPS agreement. So let's start with the basics. What is an SPS agreement or a common area? Essentially, two countries harmonize or mutually recognize the equivalence of each other's regulation in the areas of human, animal, or plant life or health. The rule of thumb is the deeper and broader the harmonization, the fewer the border checks. And a next slide, please. So this is from the European Commission. Don't worry about all the small print. Basically, every red box is a physical or documentary border check. On the right is the UK's current status as third country. On the left is Switzerland with its common food safety area. In the middle is New Zealand, which actually has an agreement with the EU. But as you can see, it doesn't do that much heavy lifting in terms of streamlining trade. So next slide, please. So to get from here to there to the green side, we need to realign both our laws and also our regulatory processes that have diverged post-Brexit. So in terms of legislative alignment, you may be thinking, well, we have a lot of the same regulations already. That is true. We literally transposed EU laws into the UK rulebooks. But while we don't have divergence in all areas in practice, we do have it by law. So in a sense, we have the worst of all worlds, right? We have full autonomy to have whatever regulation we want, which we're not really utilizing. But we're being treated as if we have completely different regulations. But we do need to agree that formally, by law, we are going to align existing and future regulation. But we also have to address divergence in the way that legislation is made and enforced, which almost by definition is a lot more dramatic, right? Because when we left the EU, we didn't transpose their agencies, their institutions, their systems, to which we had outsourced a lot. So we've had to develop a lot of new systems in the meantime. Colleagues and I have done a lot of work trying to catalog what this divergence has amounted to. I won't go into great detail here, but I think the overriding trend is that UK food law is more executive-led, because basically it was transposed largely into statutory instruments, so sort of ministerially led form of governance. It's more informal in terms of specifying the roles of different agencies and processes, and it's more fragmented between devolved nations. And I'll come back to that a bit later. But first, let's just do a very quick stock taking of the legislation that has changed. So if we can go to the next slide. I characterize this as moderate, but nonetheless, if you're an affected stakeholder, these changes can feel very significant. So I'm not going to go into all the details on this slide, but clearly precision breeding, gene editing, pesticides, leap out, and also areas where the UK has a less precautionary approach. I put weaker there. You could say less precautionary approach as well. But on animal welfare, there are some areas in which it has become stricter. Next slide, please. There are also a number of areas in which the EU has changed its legislation in a way that the UK hasn't kept pace with. And here the trend is very clear. The EU has really tightened up, for example, on pesticides, food additives, and contaminants, et cetera. And I should mention that this isn't comprehensive, but focuses on areas that are particularly pertinent to border checks. And that correspond with the scope identified in the Common Understanding in May. So, next slide, please. So in order to achieve this common area, we need to realign our legislation and our processes in some way. And that, I think, there's two kind of aspects of this. One is the external EU-facing treaty dimension, and the other is the domestic governance. And we need to figure out not only how are we going to negotiate and ratify this treaty, but also going forward, these processes have to apply to dynamic alignment. So if we look at what, we actually do have some information on the treaty level of what is going to happen if we look at the Common Understanding and also some of the negotiating mandates that have been published on the EU side. So there's a kind of an indicative list of sectoral coverage, but there's some ambiguity around the edges of what that means. So for example, and it goes beyond the kind of traditional SPS frame, and those issues are really important. So for example, labeling requirements, are those included or not? And that's going to determine who, where those border checks stop. We know there's scope for some exceptions. If we look at the Swiss common food safety area, there are exceptions. They've negotiated for higher GMO standards that they have and animal welfare standards. So there's certainly a precedent there. We know that the UK will be able to contribute to legislative formation appropriately, but we don't know what that looks like. Again, if we look to the Swiss example, that would probably be through the specialized committee in the TCA, through the kind of joint committee level, as well as participation in agencies, et cetera, which is the next point. Probably observer status in EFSA, and hopefully membership in these other bodies as well. Again, extrapolating from the Swiss agreement, but again, it's unspecified. It just says appropriate access. And finally, we know that the dispute settlement will happen through TCA structures. So arbitration with the Court of Justice is the ultimate authority on matters of EU law. Next slide, please. However, this is where we come to the internal dimension. And here we have really in the public domain, virtually no information. So, and by this, I mean, the negotiation, the ratification of the treaty, the implementing legislation, and dynamic alignment going forward. So all of these are devolved areas. What is the role of developed nations in these processes? What is the role of Parliament, including select committees? How do various stakeholders input into these processes? And what is the role of, is there any role for the broader public? It seems almost silly to put that on the list. However, I put it there because I think that what we should take away is that despite the fact that the UK is contemplating broadly aligning with the EU, there's many different ways in which the UK can do that, can implement that domestically. Next slide, please. And I think the perfect illustration of this is Switzerland. So Switzerland, you might think, is a rule taker. There's no democratic will there at all. But at the same time, Switzerland is, of course, renowned as being one of the most robust direct democracies in the world. So, how do they square that circle? If you look at the Common Food Safety Area Agreement, there you can see that this is done through essentially the EU allowing Switzerland the space to fulfill its constitutional obligations. Oh, and I didn't say something important, which is I'm going to look at different models just focusing on dynamic alignment just for the sake of time. So just looking at how the UK might manage dynamic alignment after the treaty is agreed. So when the EU passes a new legislation covered by the Food Safety Agreement, that Switzerland doesn't have to adopt it, right? So it provisionally applies, although Switzerland can say that it doesn't want to do this, and then Switzerland has 2 years to essentially complete its domestic procedures, including the possibility of a referendum. So that Switzerland could put it to a direct vote whether to align with a particular legislation. And however, if it doesn't do this, then of course there are market access consequences. The EU will act to ensure the integrity of its food safety area. So it's also an important element of the negotiation how the EU would respond to the UK not aligning. So next slide, please. There are also UK-based examples of how to manage dynamic alignment. In the case of Northern Ireland, in EU alignment, we have the Windsor Framework, which essentially, again, it's not automatic that that Northern Ireland follows new EU regulation. That's decided at the Joint Committee level. On the UK side, my colleague Billy Mello-Rauho calls it the Westminster break. Essentially, it's quite an executive-led decision in terms of whether to align or not, and failure to align, again, results in market access consequences. Next slide, please. There's also an example of unilateral alignment. In other words, it doesn't flow from a treaty, but under the Product Standards and Metrology Act, the UK government has determined that the Secretary of State can basically decide to mimic EU laws on environmental impacts of products. But this, again, is not very clear in terms of it's very executive-led. There's not really a clear sense of criteria of when you would or wouldn't align, or oversight for Parliament and how you would make those decisions. Nor role for devolved administrations. Next slide, please. So getting back to my initial framing of this, I think the point that we shouldn't lose sight of is that resets aren't just about aligning regulation and this kind of how much are we going to get up, how much are we going to give away in terms of sovereignty. It's actually about reframing what the idea of sovereignty is. And because the initial Brexit process involved such an executive transfer of regulatory powers to the executive, part of the reset also involves thinking about how regulation is made and how to make that an inclusive process to give a sense of ownership over how a reset is managed. And that even if it seems impossible to contemplate that the UK would introduce referenda on particular EU regulations, at the very least, that needs to involve a more formal role of Parliament in scrutinizing government decisions in this area, more formalized stakeholder consultation, and procedures for devolved nations to feed into the process. Next slide, please. So that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's some really helpful questions that you raised there, I think, on the mechanics and what is actually feasible, some of the precedents. You raised there the Swiss example, which I think is something that the EFRA committee, with their report that came out today, touch on this alongside some of that issue of consultation, communication with the public, which is why I'm thrilled that we have Alistair Carmichael, MP and chair of the EFRA committee, MP for Orkney and Shetland, and Alistair, since his appointment in 2001, has campaigned on a range of farming, crofting, and other rural issues. In September 2024, Alistair was elected unopposed as chair of the House of Commons EFRA, so Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. Alistair was born and raised on Islay. His parents were hill farmers rearing sheep and cattle, and he is now a partner in the family farm there as well. Alistair, welcome, and incredible timing with the EFRA committee report on making an SPS agreement work coming out this morning. Full confession, I haven't had a chance to read more than the headlines of it, but I'm thrilled that you're able to join us and tell us what those recommendations are.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, Ben, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation. And it is actually just a coincidence of timing. I would love to suggest that we were so well planned in the management of EFRA business that we were able to do this deliberately. But look, happy coincidence or not, it's a useful one. Look, you've just had a really blue chip briefing there from Emily in relation to the issues and the mechanics of this. And she teased me up nicely, really, to talk about the politics of it and the management of some of the politics of it. Because this is, look, you know, I'm a Liberal Democrat. I did not want to come out of the European Union. If I thought we could get back there tomorrow, I would be at the front of the queue to get in. But politics, as we all know, is the art of the possible. And this could be an important moment politically. Now, give full credit to Keir Starmer for what he achieved with the Reset Summit last May. Up until that point, I would have said that even trying to negotiate an agreement of this sort with the European Union was a waste of time. I saw no indication of any willingness on the part of the Union to talk to us about this. You know, after the protracted psychodramas that were involved between 2016 and 2021 when we finally left, I think they were as exhausted as we were, and they just wanted no more of it. They wanted to get on and pursue their own project, which we had chosen not to be part of. So actually, I think Keir Starmer's real achievement there in May last year was to create a political environment where this sort of thing is possible. I took the Select Committee out to Brussels in October last year, and I was really astonished by the extent given access to people in the Commission, the various trade bodies. Everybody is very positive about this. And if you've got two sides that want to do a deal, then actually that is the best way. You're halfway actually to getting the deal then. Ironically, I would say we've probably had better access to people with responsibility for this in Brussels than we have for those in London. Cabinet Office, led by Nick Thomas-Symonds, have held this really, really close to their chest in a way that is frankly unhelpful to everybody who's in the business of scrutiny of this and who cares about the ultimate outcomes. That's a big political risk from their point of view because, bluntly, if this goes wrong, then they will have nobody to blame but themselves. And it is this interaction of politics on the one hand and the very technocratic, sometimes quite nuanced detail that an SPS agreement will bring with it, that I think does bring us into dangerous territory. The stakes are high. The prize, if we can get it right, is absolutely worth it. But you have to be clear-eyed, I think, about the difficulties and the challenges that you face. Emily, at the end there, spoke a little bit about a redefinition of sovereignty. Now, I mean, that's a reflection, perhaps, of the fact that modern 21st century politics, although it faces challenges that are transnational and international in their nature, seems to paradoxically want to come back to nationalist solutions. And until we can square that circle, I don't think we're going to make any progress in any of them. But the definition of sovereignty was very much at the heart of the whole Brexit movement. And as long as we are talking about dynamic regulatory alignment, it sounds fairly innocuous. It's pretty technocratic. Once that term gets into the hands and the mouths of others, for whom sovereignty is such a big deal, then you can see that politically this could become a difficult piece of handling for the government, and without sort of intruding in private grief, you will know from the papers this morning that there are quite a lot of handling issues already within the government in terms of their own political authority. So for that reason, Keir Starmer has been determined that this would be done and implemented as quickly as possible. When we were in Brussels, people were talking then about an agreement by the end of this year, followed by an implementation by the end of 2027. I'm hearing even more ambitious targets in that respect. I'm hearing now that people think there might be a summit to sign this all off at the end of May. I will be surprised if that's the case, but if the political will exists, then of course all things are possible. But with speed, there does come an element of danger. You saw with the completion of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement at the end of 2020, where Boris Johnson came in charging through the whole process at the last minute because there was a political imperative for him to get a deal, and we spent the succeeding 5 years trying to unpick some of the worst of the damage that he did in the last few days of that negotiation. So nothing happens unless there is the political imperative there. But that political will and that political imperative does bring with it its own range of difficulties. On the subject of divergence, even though we've only been out for a relatively short period of time, there has already been a fairly significant amount of divergence between ourselves and the European Union. I'm thinking in particular of plant protection products that have been authorised. Many of those that have been authorised and which we may be required to align with in the European Union have not been ones that have been authorised with the thought of application in Britain, and especially the further north you get in the different temperatures and climates and what the wetter climate that we have there, and to shoehorn that straight into our law without any implementation period could be really, really dangerous. The Anderson Centre published a report last week for CropLife UK, saying that they think that you could, if you had a cliff edge implementation, as they call it, so no implementation period, that could be an £810 million loss to British agriculture. Now, a sector that's already suffering with a crisis of confidence and investor confidence in particular as a consequence of the uncertainty around inheritance tax changes that really is something that we could do without at the moment. It's not a given, but it does illustrate the scale of the challenge here and the real-time consequences and the business consequences of getting this wrong if we do. So the Select Committee in the report today says 24-month implementation period is essential, and I think that was an easy consensus to build within the Select Committee, and that's our very clear recommendation to the government. The difficulty we have, though, and Emily kept using the term executive-led, is that this has been very much executive-led, and I think the government wants to continue that. So Parliament is going to have to do a bit of sharp-elbowed work in order to have a proper say in relation to the implementation. I have concerns, frankly, about whether the DEFRA as a department is match fit for the implementation of an agreement of this sort and scale within the timescales that we might possibly be looking at. If you think DEFRA is already piloting a water bill through to the next session, expected in the King's Speech, we've got a fairly wide-ranging animal welfare policy, which will presumably lead to legislation at some point. And the idea that we can do this as well as all these other things that eat up parliamentary time, I think is just unrealistic. So my concern is that, bluntly, this is being driven as a political project, even with a political project with an end that I would like to see. You actually ultimately damage the cause for reintegration, better trading relationships with the European Union if you do it quickly and you get it wrong. So I'm looking here for the government to be sensible in terms of what they agree. The easiest SPS agreement to implement will be one that is the tightest. We still don't know, for example, are they negotiating on animal welfare issues? That's not part of a conventional SPS agreement, but it could well be put in there. I would say keep it tight, get it implemented as quickly as you reasonably can, and then if you want to broaden it out, then go back for more. Overreaching and failing has political consequences for us as well. We shouldn't be allowed to lose sight of that. And then finally, part of this agreement has got to look at how we influence things upstream, because I was struck. I was out in Brussels with the Select Committee in October. It was the first time I had been in Brussels since 2019. Now, back in the days when we were in the European Union, I would be out in Brussels 2 or 3 times in a quiet year. And I think we have forgotten how to do business out there. So as politicians, as political parties, as the different campaign groups and trade bodies, we need a fairly intensive crash course about how you do business in Brussels. And we need to be influencing future legislation as far upstream as possible, because remember, being outside the European Union but still wanting to have this sort of agreement with them, we will not be in the room, we will not be at the table at the point when final decisions are made. So that upstream influence, an upstream influence that comes from others than those who are just, are not just those who are in our government, because the real danger of this, of course, does lie with our own civil servants and our own procedures, because we know from recent memory that there is a certain fondness for a thing that we used to call gold plating, and that, you know, we're no longer going to be able, or there is no political advantage, certainly, to blaming others for decisions that we wanted to take for ourselves. Ben, I think that probably says enough for the moment, and we'll move to the panel if that's okay with you.
Thank you, Alistair. Really useful oversight, and just picking up on a few of the points you made there. I think this your final point around mechanisms for EU exchange, doing business with Brussels, and having the upstream influence. I think certainly it'd be good to come back to that around how one might add that to the wish list of things we'd like to see in the reset, and what does that actually look like in practice for MPs, parliamentarians, agencies, civil society, businesses, etc. And your point about timings, I think you made a very good point there around Johnson rushed a deal and Starmer is in danger of doing the same, albeit from a different with a different motive. And I guess from an EU point of view, that gives them a certain amount of power. And taken by Emily's earlier point around the Swiss example, where they had, and I might be sort of comparing apples and pears here, but the sort of 2-year constitutional process and 3-year referendum, it sounds like a common sense approach and similar to some extent to what you're suggesting there around that transition or implementation period. I guess the question is for businesses adapting to some of these agreements already there within the common understanding. That starting gun, I guess, was fired in May 2025. So hopefully, business are already starting to create that or to start that transition rather than waiting for more details, because I guess we probably won't be going back on what is already in that agreement. It'll be more a case of further details beyond that. But these are all things that'd be good to come back to in the panel, and I'm pleased to welcome first of our panelists, David Baldock, my colleague, as honorary fellow at IEEP UK, and David has a background in philosophy and economics. He joined the Institute in the mid-1980s to establish a programme of work on agricultural and rural environmental issues, and became Deputy Director in 92, Director in 98, and then Senior Fellow in 2016, and Honorary Fellow in 2025. As well as being an authority on European agricultural policy and the environment, David's specialist areas include EU strategies for climate, natural resources and public investment, and he has an active interest in sustainable development and the growing implications of building a bioeconomy. And current external commitments include membership of the Commission's high-level group on the competitiveness of the car industry in Europe. David, welcome, and I'd welcome your thoughts, 5 minutes on this question around are we on track to deliver a reset for the environment? David.
Thanks, Ben. Yes, that was an embarrassingly long introduction. If I could just make a couple of points in response to your question. First of all, as I think it's been very well pointed out by Emily and Alistair, where we are now with this SPS is very much an economic focus, seen through the lens of trade policy. So both sides are genuinely enthusiastic, both see economic benefits from an agreement if that's reached, and they both see that this gets rid of bureaucracy which has come into place in a relationship where it wasn't at that level before. So I think my sort of first comment is, well, we need some of that ambition for the environment as well, not just in terms of the potential economic benefits, but in terms of the whole environmental benefit, and indeed animal welfare benefit has come up in the Select Committee report. At the moment, we have got very much a dialogue about the economic interests of the two sides. If we look ahead on the environment, we've got several areas which at the moment look to have sort of some promise in terms of an alignment discussion. One's the ETS already, emissions trading system alignment already in the reset calculations. Others looking ahead more, but certainly being thought about, would be including circular economy alignment, things like design, common standards for that, chemicals, for example. But one thing we see about the SPS is it's got its own very characteristic and specific issues brought up, and these other areas would too. And some of them clearly introduce quite technical issues in terms of trade, but also in terms of the way that British institutions work. It isn't just legislative alignment, as Emily pointed out. in fact, what one sees is, and just to kind of spell this out even more than Emily did, since Brexit, we've seen trade policy in the UK withdraw into a cupboard away from public scrutiny to a much greater degree than it is in the EU, where there's more accountability back to the member states, back to the parliament, stakeholder inputs. You can see a system which aims for democracy. It can be very messy, as we've seen with the Mercosur deal, which is still messy, still not completed, with the EU coming to an agreement over a very long period. But it's clearly democratic, and we simply don't have in the UK at the moment this level of engagement, not only from the from authorities, in the devolved administrations, in Parliament, but also for civil society more generally. And Alistair just kind of commented on the whole relationship when he was trying to make an entree into the Cabinet Office. This, unfortunately, has become quite embedded in the UK. So it's going to be difficult to have a proper conversation about where we want to go on alignment, especially if there's any trade policy implication. If this isn't democratized and brought more into the light. Next point, I think I'd just like to say on the EU side, I think just a few cautions about what we can expect. On the one hand, the EU will be worrying always about the UK wanting to cherry pick areas where it sees advantages to itself, but not necessarily to the EU. That's very much seen as a potential British proclivity, which needs to be watched at all times. Second caution is sometimes people in the UK, I think, overlook the fact that if we do get closer to the single market, which is what Prime Minister has been saying, and in a way is what's we're doing this SPS agreement, is this means that potentially there are payments to be made from the UK into the EU, and those will have to be negotiated. We've seen this in the defence agreement. That was the stumbling block on an issue with a very, very high level of political relevance and urgency as well. Still, the deal wasn't made. So we need to be ready for that in the UK and talk about it properly and recognize that is going to be an aspect of agreements if they do impinge on the single market particularly. And I think we also have to recognize that the UK doesn't always look an attractive partner if you don't know where the politics are going to go, whether, if we did end up, for example, with a reform government, and that did end up meaning that the UK walked away from the Convention on Human Rights, this would create a crisis with the EU. So we're not, we don't represent a totally risk-free partner, and this has to be taken into account as well. And in the EU, finally, just on that side, we don't see an entirely consistent pattern in terms of standards. Some areas we've absolutely signs of European ambition. Emily put a number of slides up showing where the EU is definitely more advanced. There are other areas there right now where there are challenges against environmental legislation, where there are challenges against better regulation and the speed of regulatory processes. There are battles going on about deregulation. So the EU is not necessarily any longer a place where we can be 100% sure that once something's agreed, it's unlikely to roll back. That's not quite the case at the moment. So as we look ahead, it's probably worth saying from an environmental point of view that there's lots of areas for further work to be done, opportunities out there, and the thing that stands out for me in some ways about the SPS is where the UK could do unilateral alignment without the such need for negotiation with the EU and getting to trade issues and so forth. That could have many advantages where that's appropriate. So I think there's quite a lot of reasons to think the SPS is going to teach us quite a lot of achieved in other areas as well.
Thank you, David. And you put forward a number of really important issues there and questions that hopefully we can come back to and the panel can respond to. I think one of those that you picked up on at the start was this focus. The main focus so far of the discussions around the reset has been on the economic benefits and rather than the environmental benefits. And obviously one of the big ones that has been flagged from the get-go is around pesticides. And I'd like to introduce Josie Cohen from Pesticides Action Network UK to share her thoughts on this. Josie joined PAN UK in 2017 to head up the organisation's UK advocacy and communications work. She studied politics at university and has spent 2 decades campaigning for a range of organisations, including the League Against Cruel Sports, ActionAid, and Global Witness. And for the past 15 years, her work has focused on preventing social, environmental and human rights issues caused by industrial agriculture. And at PAN UK, she's targeted the UK government, local councils and supermarkets pushing for a major reduction in pesticide-related harms to both human health and the environment. Josie, I'd like to hand over to you.
Hi, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, really fascinating interventions. Just to pick up on a couple of things that have been said. As Emily described on the slide on legislative changes, you can really see since we left the EU that the EU and the UK have moved in different directions on pesticide standards. So as Emily highlighted, in the UK, we've seen, well, it's Great Britain actually, because obviously Northern Ireland is still under the EU pesticide regime. But in Great Britain, we've seen an increase in the safety limits for the amount of chemicals allowed in food. We've seen an increase in the active substances that are approved for use. Meanwhile, the EU has been kind of tightening up rules. So Emily gave the example of lowering import tolerances for 2 particular highly bee-toxic pesticides, neonicotinoids, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of. And this is really the EU getting stricter to prevent foreign growers from exporting to the EU and having a competitive advantage over EU growers. So you can see we're very clearly moving in different directions, and that if we don't align with EU standards, it's going to become harder and harder for UK farmers to export to the EU. Just to pick up on a couple of things that Alistair said, we actually believe that the SPS agreement poses enormous opportunities for farmers. I think there's absolutely a case for a time-limited transition period, but that should be agreed and discussed between the UK government and farmers. Not only the NFU and others, but also other farmers. We have representatives from the Nature Friendly Farming Network on the call today, and it'd be really interesting to hear what they think. It's really important that during this transition period, farmers that need to be supported to adapt to aligning are supported by the government. So that involves relaunching the sustainable farming incentives so that farmers are supported financially to align, access to agronomic advice that's not tied to the pesticide industry, and also a mechanism to help farmers to come together and peer-to-peer learning and discuss how they're going to realign. I must say, it must be remembered that the CropLife report that came out last week is from the pesticide industry, not farmers. CropLife's job is to promote the interests of the pesticide industry, pesticide manufacturers, and they predict enormous losses every time pesticide regulation is tightened up. So if we followed their lead, we would still be using DDT. So just a very recent example, in 2009, when we were negotiating the regulations on pesticide approvals at the EU, the Crop Protection Association, actually along with the government, with the Chemical Regulation Division, predicted 100% yield loss on carrots. They said the UK carrot industry would absolutely be wiped out if these rules came in. The new regulation was adopted, and actually today carrots are one of the few crops that the UK is virtually self-sufficient on. So they're predicting losses of up to 810 million in industry profit, but I would take that with a pinch of salt. And we have looked through the figures. I mean, they claim that the loss of access to actives include 4 in particular, 2 herbicides and 2 fungicides. But these actives were only approved in the UK. They've only been in use since 2022, 2023, and one of them 2024. And they are all pending approval in the EU. So the likelihood is by the time we get dynamic alignment across the line, the chances are that these actives will be available for use within the EU system anyway. So I could go on and on about how unreliable this report is, but I want to move on to the enormous opportunities that dynamic alignment on pesticide standards poses for a wide range of groups. So just to say, what does it mean? So really, we know that safety limits or maximum residue levels in food will be aligned. We're pretty certain that active substance approvals will be aligned. So anything approved for use in the EU will have to be approved for use here. We don't know yet if conditions of use will be attached to approval. So for example, the famous one is glyphosate, where the EU reapproved it in 2023 with ban on its use as a pre-harvest desiccant. Will that come across into UK law? We hope so. We don't know. Will biocides that are used in food production, such as disinfectants, be in scope? We still don't know. But it's really important to note that nothing in the SPS agreement prevents the UK going further. If we want to bring in more protective rules on pesticides, we absolutely can. Plus, the UK, as all member states do, continue to approve products. So active substances are approved at the EU level, but products are approved nationally. So we still maintain a lot of control. In terms of the opportunities, obviously, there's human health and environmental protection. The EU has the best regulatory system in the world in terms of protecting from the harms of pesticides. I was shocked to learn this week that since EU exit, Great Britain has diverged on roughly 5% of our maximum residue levels. So we have around a total of 250,000 maximum residue levels, which are basically for one chemical on one crop, for example, chlorpyrifos on apples. 12,000 of those residue levels have now diverged from their EU equivalents, and the vast majority are now weaker. So that does pose a major risk to food safety and consumer health. In reality, what that means is we have higher levels of pesticides in our food. So it's an enormous win for both human health and environment. In terms of farmers, despite the recent report, as Emily said, 60% of our export market remains the EU. If GB exports contain traces of actives not approved or residues above EU safety limits, then exports risk being rejected. And as I said, as the EU gets tighter on their own rules, that becomes harder and harder. So again, it's really important that the UK government does support farmers that have diverged to realign. Thirdly is UK supermarkets, another major food retailer. So we work very closely with UK supermarkets, helping them reduce pesticide harms linked to their supply chains. And I happened to be with Waitrose when we read the text of the reset agreement in May. And Waitrose staff jumped up and we were all like, oh my God, yeah, because it has caused so many problems for their global supply chains, the divergence. So a lot of them actually, we advise them, and a lot of them actually where EU and GB standards diverge, they adopt the stricter of the two to simplify. But there's enormous benefit for supermarkets and other global food businesses. In the meantime, just a point is that we're continuing to diverge. So every month or so, we'll announce an automatic extension approval for an active substance. We'll weaken our MRLs. And we have said to DEFRA, why are we continuing to diverge if we're just going to realign? It's making things very, very complicated for business. On our borders, so Great Britain's border testing regime is very, very under-resourced, and the effectiveness of the surveillance regime, which covers most food imports, is highly questionable. A few weeks after the reset agreement was announced on the 2nd of June, the UK government actually scrapped border checks on all fruit and veg coming from the EU. And I think it's a great opportunity to invest that saved resource into the surveillance regime for food coming from non-EU countries, especially those that were expecting a big rise in agricultural exports from places like India with much weaker pesticide standards than our own. Finally, there's an enormous win on capacity and cost. Savings to the public purse. So the UK lacks the resources to run a robust standalone pesticide regime. We're not keeping up with the tasks required. We're giving automatic extensions to pesticides. We haven't got the capacity to go through the proper renewals process. We're aligning our maximum residue levels with crappy international standards. The great European databases, which we used to use, have been replaced simply with spreadsheets. Dynamic alignment will relieve the UK government of this burden. We'll be able to go back to relying on huge institutions like EFSA and ECHA to perform these roles that are currently being handled by the Chemical Regulation Division, which I don't know is about 200 staff, and the Expert Committee on Pesticides, which now sits at about 20 people. So I'll conclude here, but just to say, dynamic alignment is a win-win-win-win for human health, for environment, for food businesses, including farmers, and for saving the government public money. I think it's really important to remember that the public didn't vote for Brexit because they wanted more toxic chemicals in their food and in their countryside. Great Britain has had since January 2020 to create a functioning pesticide regime, which offers a similar level of protection as the one we had as an EU member state, and we failed to do so. So let's take the opportunity to realign, let's help farmers to do so, and let's sort of grab this opportunity with both hands.
Thank you, Josie. So my computer decided to freeze right at that point. Really, really useful perspective there. I think you sort of touched on a number of different benefits that just aren't getting enough light of day. And I was really taken by your point around DEFRA's decisions to approve products that actually further lead to further divergence. And I guess this is one of the things coming back to this transition. At the very least, we need to be heading in the right direction rather than continuing in a different direction. And this point on burdens for DEFRA and that point around better information sharing. There's a couple of questions that have come up in the chat around DEFRA's role on this that hopefully we can come back to in the discussion. Lots to come back to in the discussion. But I'd like to welcome our final panelist. And lest we forget, the reset is not just about the SPS deal. There's a lot more in it. And I wanted to return to this topic around emissions trading schemes, CBAM, and so I'm delighted to be joined by Beth Barker, who's head of policy at Aldersgate Group, where she leads the development and delivery of its policy work programme. And Beth's work spans a broad range of energy and environmental policy areas, including power systems, industrial decarbonisation, green finance, skills, resource efficiency, and nature-related disclosures. And prior to joining Aldersgate Group, Beth was a senior programme manager at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, where she supported the UK Corporate Leaders Group and the Aviation Impact Accelerator. She holds a BA in Geography and MSc in Environment and Sustainable Development, and has previously worked with the Cambridge Cycling Campaign and Cambridge Conservation Research Institute. Beth, it'd be great to get your perspective and add a little, I guess, some of these diversity of the different issues that come as part of the reset. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben, and great to be here. So I was asked to talk a little bit about what's going on with emission trading schemes and linkage, and some reflections on that as part of the wider reset. As I'm sure you're all aware, the UK used to be part of a wider emissions trading scheme when it was part of the EU, but since Brexit has operated its own trading scheme. And essentially how this works is by setting a limit or the cap on emissions for eligible sectors. In the UK context, it's heavy industry, power and aviation, current development around expanding that. And essentially the scheme incentivizes investment in decarbonisation by setting a carbon price. And these schemes have been developing gradually over time, but they are broadly the same, the UK and EU, although their sector scope, market mechanisms are slightly different. And more recent significant development on both sides of the channel is the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the aim here is to address carbon leakage created by setting a carbon price domestically that is not faced elsewhere in the world. And the EU had a kind of transition phase, but it came into full operation at the start of this year. The UK is currently designing its equivalent scheme, CBAM for short, and that will come into effect at the beginning of next year. Since in May 2025, the UK government and EU agreed to enter into negotiations to link their emissions trading schemes. And this was set off in the 2021 Trade and Cooperation Agreement, where it was said that both jurisdictions would come back to look at carbon market linkage and the opportunities that this could bring. And so since May, the negotiation mandate on the EU side has been agreed. In November 2025, negotiations are starting. And in December, we got a joint statement that said that they are aiming to conclude the negotiations by the next UK-EU summit, and that will be this year. And so if all goes to plan, we could start seeing the linkage by then, and then they can looking at how CBAMs could be exempted on both sides. So practically speaking, linkage means that both UK and EU firms can buy and trade allowances, and it would lead to carbon price, reduce the divergence in carbon price between the two jurisdictions. And so this is widely seen as bringing great benefits, particularly to the UK. Since we left the EU's trading scheme, our market has suffered from liquidity issues, big fluctuations in price, and both sides will suffer from trade friction. And this would only increase if our businesses on both sides have to comply with each other's carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So it's seen as a huge benefit, the idea of linking. And what this would mean is that it will open up the opportunity for mutual exemptions from CBAMs. But the linkage agreement must be in place in order for us to get the CBAM exemption. And so negotiations started, and a lot of the kind of, I guess, dynamics of what that negotiation might look like have been covered by other speakers today, including the idea of dynamic alignment, what the UK can expect from these kind of relationships with the EU in this reset around rule and decision shaping rather than making, potentially being more of a rule taker. But the idea fundamentally is that the UK will be able to keep its design of its scheme. The EU will have its own design, but they will be linked, which is important because the UK has developed its own scheme to fit with its own particular context. The EU is looking to implement ETS2, which covers different sectors. The UK is not taking the same approach on. And so being able to have control of the design of the scheme and the scope is really important, and is something that businesses really care about. I think I'm aware of time, but a couple of reflections. One is that the ETS schemes on both sides are developing a lot, and particularly with CBAM, this is a novel policy, and we've seen quite a lot of change, pushback, debate around how both schemes on both sides of the channel are designed. And so it will be interesting as we look towards linkage, how both jurisdictions develop their ETS schemes, but also how they develop their CBAM. And we obviously will be hoping that they're paying close attention to how both schemes are working, how they're functioning, and what the impacts are for businesses and economics, and of course the environment. And I think this is my final reflection, is that ultimately these schemes are trying to drive decarbonisation in an economically competitive way. And so while a lot of this negotiation is around how can these schemes function better, we also have to ask the question, are they delivering their intended outcome in terms of helping our compliance sectors to decarbonise? And so one thing I would get you to look out for this year is that we're expecting phase 2 of the evaluation of the UK ETS, which should evaluate how it is impacting carbon decarbonisation and also carbon leakage. And I think that will be really interesting to inform ETS policy going forward, and how well it helps the UK and the EU to deliver on its net zero plans. Back to you, Ben.
Thank you, Beth. Sorry for the delay there. Really, really insightful. I'm going to ask all the panelists to join and switch on their cameras and go straight into questions. And Beth, actually, I was going to come back to you first as a follow-up to your intervention there. And obviously, you made the point there about the EU CBAM coming into force on the 1st of January this year. and until that agreement has been struck to link UK and EU schemes, just wondering, this is going to affect some UK businesses, but I was just wondering, can you explain a little more about how this might be passed on to consumers, and how likely you think we are to see an agreement struck this year?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because immediately after the negotiation announcement, there was a huge call from businesses to push for an immediate exemption from the EU CBAM, particularly as we have that year gap between the EU one and the UK. And that didn't happen, and I think it was always very unlikely. But what has been good to see is the pace at which the negotiation is going forward, and that quite strong statement in December that they're hoping to conclude it by the next summit. And the reason that I hope they can stick to that timeline is, as you say, because UK businesses will currently be facing the EU CBAM. This creates trade friction because even though UK businesses face a carbon price, they will be having to comply with the EU system, and this ultimately can create administrative burden, takes capacity, potentially has an impact on UK exports to the EU. It's obviously a bit early to say exactly how that's playing out, given we're only a month into the new system. But I think it is fair to say that the policy uncertainty that a kind of uncertain negotiation process creates is something that affects business decision making and has kind of consequences for investment. And we see this because not only are businesses waiting to see the conclusion of the linkage negotiation, but then ultimately they'll need to find out, will there be a CBAM exemption on both sides? Because that has to be agreed afterwards. And then, of course, there's the question of what's in the detail of that agreement and what does that mean for future ETS and CBAM design. So, and that is consequential because the UK has been going through a huge number of consultations looking at market mechanisms, the next phase of the scheme, and all of these decisions, including the integration of carbon removals, are subject to the linkage negotiation. So the quicker we can see the policy certainty played out, the better. But of course, UK businesses and EU businesses will be wanting to see that negotiation benefit them. And of course, the UK government will be very mindful of that. And there may be a trade-off between speed and making sure they get everything they want out of that negotiation.
Well, quite. I think that seems to be a running theme of today's webinar. I wanted to bring in Emily and raise a question around Northern Ireland. And I should say to any panelists, please raise your hand if you want us to jump in on anything that's sort of coming. I'm going to keep an eye on the screen. Emily, so Windsor Framework and Northern Ireland Protocol provided a slightly awkward set of exceptions and unique rules compared to the rest of GB. I was just wondering how much you think the veterinary agreement and other aspects of the reset smooth out some of these issues, or perhaps even override some of those agreements.
Sure, just briefly. I mean, I think that it should an SPS agreement and ETS linking as well, and CBAM exemption should be good for Northern Ireland as it's already in the EU regulatory space. So it eliminates the intra-UK regulatory barriers, and indeed that was a major motivation for both. Just in the context of the SPS agreement, for example, I know the EFRA committee has looked at the not for EU labeling, so hopefully it would eliminate that requirement. And I think another potential benefit is that the UK as a whole will be essentially advocating its interest in EU regulatory committees, which Northern Ireland is sort of on its own, out on a limb now. I think it's really unclear how these kind of committee structures will be joined up. And so there is this tricky technical aspect of the fact that the Windsor framework will still exist. That's clearly set out in the common understanding. The UK and the EU will still be in different customs areas. There will still be goods that aren't kind of exempted, in the SPS agreement, the non-SPS agreement goods. So presumably the green lane and the red lane system will still remain in place. And so I think that, how do we merge these systems? There's some tricky questions there.
Thank you, Emily. And I'm going to bring in a couple of questions that have come up from the audience around representation, involvement in decision making. That I'll come to you first on Emily, and maybe you don't want to answer them. Maybe there's other people that want to speak to them around local authority involvement. I'm not sure if you've picked up on this question in the Q&A. I'm welcome. I can read it out again, but also I suppose to weave in this issue around devolved wishes and the UK Internal Markets Act. So there was one specifically around GM and how the UK Internal Market Act, which DEFRA have declared will allow GM products into NI, Scotland and Wales, even against the sort of express wishes of devolved administrations and without mandatory labelling. I'm not sure if this is something you feel able to comment on around how does that change within the current thinking around the reset agreement?
Again, I'll be brief, and I'm very interested in others' views as well on this. But there's a kind of two levels to it. There's one level which is the political level, and on that level, the devolveds have generally, although not always, been more aligned with EU in different ways. So actually, again, like with Northern Ireland, bringing those into formal alignment is something that, you know, at least in the current configuration, would ease intergovernmental relations. However, the other really important level of that is the legal level, and we actually have a completely different management of our internal market than we did as EU members. So we're looking at, you know, trying to get back to something that looks more like how it was when we were an EU member state, where there was more explicit harmonization, but that has to have some conscious effort in terms of addressing how that's going to be brought into being legally in a way that respects devolved nations, devolved areas, and not just assuming that they'll just agree to everything. So I think the UK needs to set up some sort of bespoke governance structure to address that.
And do you think that would apply for local authorities as well? I think this is, you know, not something that's necessarily come up in a lot of the discussions around the implications of the reset.
It's a great question, and I'll leave it for others.
Brilliant, and indeed, encourage people to the panel to respond in writing where they feel they're able to the questions. We'll try and get through as many as we can. Alistair, I'd love to bring you in on this question, and then I might sort of ask another thing of you as well. Alistair, over to you.
Sure. I think we are underestimating the political challenges that this represents. And we're doing it in all sorts of different ways, in all sorts of different fronts. Part of the difficulty with the way that the Cabinet Office is running the negotiation is that it seems to me they're not actually taking the devolved administrations along with them, and that just looks like it's heaping up problems for the future. The way devolution is supposed to work is it's supposed to be collaborative between the different parts of the United Kingdom. In fact, for the last 15 years or so, it has worked in the opposite way, where the different responsibilities become wedges to drive between the different governments. And it seems to me that the Cabinet Office is just risking creating that future level of grievance there, which is not helpful, and it's just so unnecessary. On all fronts, though, I come back to my point. The easiest agreement to implement will be the tightest. And if we come back then at some future date and we want to expand because we've had an agreement, an SPS agreement, and the world kept turning on its axis, and now we want to do more, that is going to be the best way to do this. You know, do not underestimate the political trauma that was Brexit to our politics as a whole. And to get back this far, even at this stage, I think is a quite remarkable position. So do not, please, for God's sake, allow the best to be the enemy of the good. And we need to keep the focus on the end game here, because I don't want to get into everything that Josie said, but I understand where you're coming from, Josie, and I see that you've got one very particular area of interest and expertise to pursue here. But ultimately, there is a bigger picture at play here, and it is about the better trading relationship between ourselves and the rest of the European Union. But if we see this as an opportunity just to get one over on a particular sector or people that we don't like, then we risk losing it just becomes another stick to beat farmers or beat pharma or whoever with. And at that point, the political case for getting that degree of integration becomes that much more difficult. And the ultimate political destination that I want to get to, which I suspect is not that different from anybody else on the platform, gets put further to the right in terms of the timeline. So, I think this is a moment for cool heads, but the advantage of bringing in the NFU or the Nature Friendly Farming Network or anybody else is that you tie them into it. And that, it's more difficult for them to turn around and say, no, this is not something that we're going to be happy with. We need to build the broadest consensus at the earliest stage. And that's a political point. It's not a negotiating point. It's not a point about the actual operation of the SPS. It's about how we get from where we are to where we want to be. Baby steps.
Thank you, Alistair. And I'd like to return to the politics and pesticides in a second. First, I just wanted to, I suppose, come back to this point on farmers and fishers. And I guess the impact of the reset that's been presented is a mixed bag for both. Who do you think are going to be the winners and losers out of the reset?
We haven't spoken about fishers yet. And they're already losers from this, especially in the channel fisheries, for example, but not exclusively. Boris Johnson agreed, as far as the fishing industry was concerned, a truly dreadful deal for the fishing industry. It just gave us the worst of all possible worlds. There were all sorts of things that he signed up to that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Some of it was around quotas and tax, but some of it was around access. And given the way in which he had used the fishing industry in that campaign, it was an utter disgrace to just push them out the way at the very last possible moment there. The fishing industry themselves and fishing ports right around the country were putting a lot of store in the review of the TCA, which is due to come up this year, which basically the Reset Summit preempted last year. It's a colossal achievement to start with an EU ask of an extension of 5 years of an agreement that basically no sector in our own fishing industry wanted renewed for more than 1 year at a time. And then to walk away claiming a victory because instead of 5 years, you've got it renewed for 12. But from the environmental perspective, if you're going to look at some of the under pressure stocks in the channel in particular, then that keeping bigger boats out of the 6 to 12 mile limit around the south coast is particularly important. That's why access was such a big deal for the industry, and that's why the extension of the fisheries provision for another 12 years is not good news, either for the industry or for the sustainability of fish stocks there. That's not an either or, but there's no future for the industry without sustainable fish stocks. We then get given a £360 million growth fund over 12 years, which frankly is giving peace to natives. Look, judge at the end of the day who the biggest winners and losers are, but I've got to say that the fishing industry or our fishing industries are already making a compelling case for that particularly unwanted title of being the biggest losers.
Thank you, Alistair. I'm pleased you touched on that. I wanted to kind of bring in some of the other issues that are perhaps less focused on in the SPS deal. I think some of the speakers have covered on them, and a number of the questions have come in around these. I wanted to go back to Josie first to talk a bit about pesticides, and then hopefully come into some of these issues around timber regulations and soil growing media. So be prepared, panelists. I will come to you on this. But Josie, I wanted to first come to you around dynamic alignment on what appears on the surface to be stronger regulations on pesticides in the EU. And this initially looks like a good thing, but I'm just wondering if you wanted to comment on whether that's still the case, if you want to comment on sort of direction of travel, and I guess moreover with the reset deal, whether you think how you think UK producers are going to respond to those pesticide regulations. Are there any sort of unforeseen circumstances there?
Thanks, Ben. So many of you may know that the Commission have released something called the Food and Feed Safety Omnibus, which was published towards the back end of last year. They do put forward a major weakening of EU pesticide standards. So there's loads of information out there, but just a few examples. They remove time-limited approvals for most pesticides. They restrict member states' ability to use the most recent scientific evidence when authorizing products. They weaken the definition of biocontrols. They make drones more possible. However, despite all of these are draft proposals. Despite all of this, I still believe that dynamic alignment is still a very good thing for the UK. A lot of people have alluded to the kind of consolidation of executive power and the lack of transparency in lots of areas since Brexit. And pesticides is no different. When we left the EU, we lost a huge amount of oversight, checks and balances. We consolidated power in the hands of ministers. So, we have DEFRA as the decision maker, but in reality, HSE is the implementer, and they take a lot of decisions. And so we're very unable to influence pesticide regulation as it stands in the UK. In contrast, at the EU level, when the initial proposals for the omnibus were published, there was a massive pushback from civil society in certain member states, and they have already been watered down. In the UK, we have no such influence. So regardless of what happens on the omnibus, dynamic alignment puts us back under a pesticide regime that is at least in some ways transparent and accountable. The UK government must make sure built into the SPS agreement are channels for the UK to influence UK pesticide regulations. European pesticide regulations. I think it's really important to note that the UK was instrumental in designing those regulations until 2021. They were our regulations, and Northern Irish producers have never left them. So I think to see them as something alien and separate, we've only been out of them 5 years. And then just to come back to Alistair's point, it's absolutely not about beating farmers. And I'm really sorry if that's what came across, because what this actually does for farmers is restore frictionless access to their biggest export market. I think if the EFRA committee could get behind the call to say that actually it's two sides of the same coin, if we're going to ask farmers to realign, we need to improve the support we're offering farmers to do that. We need to relaunch the SFI. We need to make sure the support is in place for farmers to do that. But I would argue that actually the bigger picture, as Alistair said, the bigger picture is about economic growth. It's about trade with the EU. And wouldn't it be a terrible thing if we scuppered that for access to a handful of chemicals? So I think, I would, there may be unforeseen circumstances. I really hope not. It's very hard to predict everything, particularly with agriculture, which is so sort of context specific. But I think as long as we have the channels and the government are in consultation with farmers, the support structures for farmers are in place, and the UK has channels for feeding those concerns back into the EU, then if there are unforeseen circumstances, there will be ways to tackle them.
Thank you, Josie. And from pesticides, I wanted to move on and welcome any of the panel to comment on some of the other aspects of the SPS, or that might end up getting caught up in the SPS, around whether this, I suppose, adoption of EU standards might affect other elements of our food system, food laws. Is this going to restrict the UK's ability to label novel food? Vegetarian sausages has been something that's come up a lot in EU discussions. Will this affect the horticultural peat ban? So we had a question from the audience around the movement of soil and growing media and plant imports. Implications be for horticultural peat ban, which is promised by government but hasn't yet come through into legislation. Or as another another attendee has asked around timber regulations, will a UK-EU SPS common area affect, and whether trade laws such as the UK timber regulation and deforestation, EU deforestation regulation, could they form part of this? Are they going to be adopted. And of course, lest we forget, within the Environment Act, the UK government many years ago did commit to its own Forestry Risk Commodities Act, which is a sort of parallel of the EUDR, but it hasn't yet come to see the light of day. I would welcome any panelists who want to jump in on any or all of those points. I know we're short of time, so yeah, please unmute. Oh, Alistair.
I can jump in on them all in an omnibus sort of way, because I can start by saying I don't know the answer to any of them. But I think the fact that these questions are all posed illustrate rather well the dangers surrounding a cliff edge implementation, if you know what I mean. This is why that 24-month implementation period that we've identified in our report, I think, really matters. Because it's the sheer scale of and range of things that we're dealing with here. And I just don't think that DEFRA is match fit for this yet. They're doing it at the same time as a water bill. They've got an animal welfare white paper that's in play at the moment. And as a department, they have struggled in recent years in getting the implementation of all sorts of schemes and regulations post Brexit out the door. We treated them for 40 odd years as being the London branch office of the EU Commission, and now suddenly we expect them to do all sorts of head office functions, and they are struggling with it. So, the idea that we're going to be ready to go with all this on day one, I'm afraid, is a dangerous fiction.
Thank you, Alistair. Really, really helpful response. David, I wanted to bring you in. We're running short of time, but I had a bit of a double header question for you, which is around firstly, the Trading Cooperation Agreement is due for review later this year. Do you think that the reset overrides those processes? Some voices within the UK Parliament seem to think so, EU less so. And a question from the audience that you might feel you're able to respond to, which is around what provision is being made. I think we could perhaps reframe that. What provision could or should be made around future post-agreement policy divergence if the UK wants to diverge on certain standards? How might that be built into the reset agreement? Putting you on the spot there, David.
Well, on the TCA, no, it doesn't override the TCA. The TCA is a fundamental framework for the moment, and it doesn't mean that can't be modified over time, but I don't see it as overriding that, no. And I think the EU sees the TCA as a hard negotiated outcome and not something to be readily put on one side either. I don't know whether Emily really might be the better person to comment on that sort of last aspect of your question, though.
I see Emily's nodding. Emily,
I see we're at 1:30, so in 30 seconds. I think very much TBD in terms of what kind of cooperation and exceptions there are going to be. If we get into the details, I think for the UK being part of the EU's kind of biosecurity systems and space is probably a better way to keep our borders safe than being outside of them, just in terms of communication of threats and risks. As to whether we're going to align on things like deforestation-free products, I think it depends on if you read the general consumer protection rules applicable to the production, distribution, and consumption of agri-food products as containing that. I would, that's from the common understanding. I would argue that no, that doesn't include that. But I think it raises a bigger question, which is to what extent are we aligning strategically with the EU? And also, what that means in terms of our identity as a post-Brexit nation. And I think these kind of bigger questions and how they're positioned with the deregulatory forces on both sides of the channel are really interesting ones to watch going forward.
Well, that's a really good point to start wrapping up. Bigger questions that I hope that we can come back to in a future webinar. This will not be the end of our scrutiny of the reset. I'm going to use my what I usually do as a roundup, but I'm going to actually offer this back to the panel just to all unmute and give a 10-second answer each on what one new thing you would like to see in the reset discussions that come up in May and June, assuming, perhaps optimistically, that there might be room for scope to look at other things for the environment. What would you like to see the EU and UK discussing? I'll see whoever is going to unmute to go first, or otherwise I'll pick on you. Josie, thank you.
Yeah, it needs to include UK REACH. So it needs to include REACH and all other industrial chemicals. So at the moment, we have a very weird chemicals regime where they're governed completely separately, and it's quite incoherent. So if we're going to align on pesticides, let's align on all chemicals policy.
Well, it sounds like you've got the support of the Chancellor, who's long been talking about this. So I'm guessing the barrier there must be the EU, but I think, yeah, that has to be high on the list. Who would like to go next on that wish list? David?
Yes, chemicals are obviously one. I would point to the circular economy, though, as well. You can't really have a circular economy done in little areas all on their own. It does need join up at a European level. It really cries out for that. The UK has definitely fallen behind on quite a few regulatory elements of that. So I'd like to see that.
That's a good plug for our event next week with Commissioner Roswell and Mary Cray. We'll see what they have to say on cooperation and circular economy there. Beth?
I was going to say something to David, but my other one is that I would love to see a real focus on interoperability of embodied carbon standards and product labels and digital product passports, so that we can have really strong trade of low carbon products between the two jurisdictions.
Thank you, Beth. Emily, anything you'd like to see on the reset agenda for the summer?
Yeah, mine is similar to Beth, since I'm at a 3-day Wilton Park conference on CBAMs right now. I've been thinking a lot about the risks of divergence between EU and UK CBAM. I don't think there's nearly enough attention to that, in particular, how to mutually recognize the monitoring, reporting and verification of both systems.
Thank you. And Alistair, over to you for any final comments.
Well, look, having said in the whole webinar, just keep it tight, keep it tight. I'm going to just repeat that. I honestly, maybe I'm just too superstitious, but you cannot underestimate the political challenge that's involved here. It does come with a great political prize if we can actually get it. I wouldn't have believed it possible to be back here. So I think everybody keep cool heads, don't get too excited. Get something that works and that we can make work, so that we can prove the concept of what can be achieved by integration, and then come back for more in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. And yeah, as to what more might look like, of course, we haven't even managed to touch on things like or the customs union, which a lot of people are speculating over. Again, one for another webinar. So watch this space if we can do some work on that in future. Look, this leaves me, and I apologise, we're running 5 minutes over, bad practice on my part, but I would really like to thank all the speakers, all the organisers, those working behind the scenes, Ed and also Clara, for making this work. Feedback form, please fill it in. It's going to be coming up on your screens very automatically. I'd also like you I'd like to invite you all to our next IEEP UK webinar, which is going to be on air quality and can the UK feasibly reach WHO targets, a devolved perspective, and also to flag our newsletter. Please do sign up to that if you want to keep in touch with our work. Thank you, everybody. We're going to be keeping the webinar open for another 5 minutes. I'll be switching off my camera, but this hopefully will give everyone a chance to say their farewells in the chat, but also for any panelists to have a chance to answer any of those questions. There's a lot there that we didn't manage to get through, and some excellent questions. So please do hang around for 5 minutes behind the scenes if you can, whilst we slowly say goodbye. But thank you, everybody, for your input today, and see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.